So let's begin our discussion of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution with a guy named Greg Johnson. He, like a lot of us, had some beef with the government. He decided to do some protests, including die-ins, which he would basically lie down and pretend he's dead in front of the Capitol. To take it a step further, he actually burned an American flag in front of City Hall. And this was in violation of, at the time, Texas state law. And because of that, he was sent to prison. Well, he said, you know what, it's my First Amendment right to be able to speak my mind, and this is a form of speech, burning the flag. The Supreme Court eventually agreed with him, and so he was allowed to do that. Now, a lot of people in America would say, you know, the majority rule set up the law against flag burning because we mostly agree that it's a bad thing to burn a flag. So why does this guy get away with this? Well, of course, it was important to the Founding Fathers that while the majority did rule, the minority rights were not infringed. And that's why they really set up this kind of complex system of checks and balances, individual liberties, and majority rule. So we can begin examining the system of checks and balances in America, continuing with the Johnson flag burning case. After that case was decided, George H.W. Bush, the president, disagreed with the Supreme Court and said, you know what, let's have a constitutional amendment. He couldn't get the support for that. It's pretty tough to get an amendment to the Constitution passed. But Congress had enough influence to be able to pass a federal law banning flag burning. Remember that the Johnson case involved a Texas state law. Well, this law passed in the Congress and was signed by the president, but eventually, through another case, made it back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court again said, look guys, we already told you this. It's going to be individual liberty, First Amendment rights to burn a flag. Therefore, we find this law unconstitutional. And that's what's really so great about our Constitution, is that it does allow for the majority to make the laws and rule, but at the same time it protects those most basic and unalienable rights, such as free speech, that Mr. Johnson and all of us enjoy. Another thing that it does, of course, it is the supreme law of the land. So any law created, like the Texas law or the act passed by Congress, can be found invalid if it is found to be in conflict with the Constitution of the United States. It also helps to kind of separate power, or decentralize power. As we can see, it sets up the Congress, the President, and the judicial branch, which we all see in play there with the Texas case. Of course, to understand the Constitution, we really need to understand the roots of the revolution in America and the establishment of the new government. And of course, this is mostly a review, but you remember that the colonists actually had it really well in America, excluding, of course, the slaves and indentured servants. But of white colonists, it was said by Gordon S. Wood that those peoples were freer, more equal, more prosperous, and less burdened with cumbersome feudal and monarchical restraints than any other part of mankind. So really, they had it better than anyone in the world. Of course, they did pay taxes, but no more than anyone in Britain. They didn't really complain about that. What changed everything, of course, was the French-Indian or 7 Years' War. And as you can see here in the image, a lot of territory was gained by Britain, and that was their really excuse to say, you know what, now we have a lot more land to protect here, so it's going to cost more money, and where are we going to get that money? Of course, from the colonists. So they institute a series of new taxes, and of course the colonists started to have a problem with that, particularly because they weren't being asked what they thought about it. You'll remember that in order to deal with this idea of taxation without representation, the Continental Congress is convened with guys such as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Ben Franklin, and they first try to talk with Britain about representation, and it doesn't work out so well. So then they get a little bit irrational and start throwing tea into the harbor and making more than a big deal out of what was not quite a massacre in Boston. And eventually say, okay, either we're going to have to just do everything they tell us to and not complain about it, or we're going to have to revolt, one extreme or the other. So they decide on revolution, and Thomas Paine, of course, has the job of popularizing this idea through what would now be like a viral YouTube video, but at the time was a tract called Common Sense. He writes that, and it gets spread all around the colonies, and lots of people get this fiery indignation, and they're ready to revolt against the mother country. And we happen to have some footage of this debate.
I remind Mr. Rutledge and Mr. Duane that blood has been shed. Massachusetts blood. While we debate, our militia is left without munitions, without arms, without even the slightest encouragement.
Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
One colony cannot be allowed to take its sister colonies headlong into the maelstrom of war. Parliament will be eager to call a halt to hostilities, as are we. They will seek conciliation. We must offer them an olive branch. I move this assembly consider a humble and dutiful petition be dispatched to His Majesty, one that includes a plain statement that the colony desires immediate negotiation and accommodation of these unhappy disputes, and that we are willing to enter into measures to achieve that reconciliation. Second.
Mr. Dickinson. The time for negotiation is past. The actions of the British Army at Lexington and Concord speak plainly enough. If we wish to regain our natural-born rights as Englishmen, then we must fight for them.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society. I have looked for our rights in the Constitution of the English government and found them there. Our rights have been violated, Mr. Adams. That is beyond dispute. We must provide a plan to convince Parliament to restore those rights. Do we wish to become aliens to the mother country? No! No, gentlemen. We must come to terms with the mother country. No doubt the same ship which carries forth our list of grievances will bring back their redress.
Mr. Dickinson. My wife and young children live on the main road to Boston, fewer than 5 miles from the full might of the British Empire. Should they sit and wait for Gage and his savages to rob them of their home, their possessions, their very lives? No, sir. Powder and artillery are the surest and most infallible conciliatory measures we can adopt.
If you exclude the possibility of peace, Mr. Adams, then I tell you no. You have blood on your hands.
And I tell you, Mr. Dickinson, that to hold out an olive branch to Britain is a measure of gross imbecility.
If you New England men continue to oppose our measures of reconciliation, you will leave us no choice but to break off from you entirely and carry on the opposition in our own way.
Here.
I sit in judgment on no man's religion, Mr. Dickinson. But your Quaker sensibilities do us a gross disservice, sir. It is one thing to turn the other cheek, but to lie down on the ground like a snake and crawl toward the seat of power in abject surrender. Well, that is quite another thing, sir. And I have no stomach for, sir. No stomach at all.
We will exhaust all peaceful approaches, Mr. Adams. And we will do it with or without the approbation of you and your Boston insurrectionists.
Hear, hear. Mr. Dickinson's motion to send an olive branch petition to His Majesty has been made and seconded. We shall proceed to a vote.
New Hampshire.
I don't get the idea that everybody was excited about the idea of revolution just because they thought it's the best option. Many people like John Adams, as you can see here, were a little bit apprehensive, to say the least, of the results of the revolution in this letter that he wrote to his wife, Abigail. So the decision was made to revolt, and one of the first things that had to be done was to send an ultimatum of sorts to the king. This was known as the Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson with help from John Adams and Ben Franklin. And what it was really a set of arguments, a polemic against King George. 27 of the 32 paragraphs of the Declaration are actually pointing out injustices by the king against the people in the colonies. And another thing that you'll notice about the document is that it's full of these sorts of enlightened ideas of natural rights and consent of the governed and limited government, things that the English had actually adopted and that we kind of assumed would also apply to us. So we're pointing out to the king, hey, you guys made these ideas, but now they are universal, so we deserve those same types of rights, and you need to hook us up. And it was also kind of a plea to other countries like France and the Netherlands to kind of hook us up with some money, which they did. And you know the rest of the story from 8th grade and 11th grade history class. As you can see here, the Americans are victorious, and now it is the obligation of these revolutionaries to establish a new government. And they take this very seriously. They understand that they don't want to make the same mistakes as the British, as great as that country was. They wanted to establish their own constitution, as it were. So this fear that the colonists had of strong central government really is evident in the first constitution that they compose, which is known as the Articles of Confederation. And you'll see that it actually gives most power to the colonies or the states. And the only thing that exists at the federal level, not a president, not a judicial branch at all, no courts, but just a unicameral legislature with one vote or one representative, as it were, per state. So here we can see some of the powers given to the federal government, not many, by the Articles of Confederation. Basically, they needed to be able to have an army and declare war and make agreements with other countries. What is definitely absent from the Articles of Confederation is any kind of revenue that the government would get. That makes it kind of hard to wage war. And there were also a lot of problems with interstate commerce and the federal government not being able to really do much about that. In addition to the lack of revenue received under the Articles of Confederation, there were problems just with people not showing up. And then when they tried to solve the economic problems by selling land, issuing underpriced securities, and actually printing more money, this led to inflation and further economic woe. Really, the only benefits of the Articles of Confederation were that it provided a means for the federal government to deal with westward expansion and the territories that have not yet been explored at this point. And also, you could just say that it was a starting point. So they kind of did a trial run. Now they have an opportunity to improve the next time around. During this time, most of the action is actually happening at the state level. States, especially in the northeast, such as Massachusetts, are starting to think and talk and legislate about the rights of men and get very particular and specific about religious qualifications and say, whereas, this state like Maryland was Catholic, maybe we should start to have a freedom of religion in our state. They also started to give more people the opportunity to vote. So you can see kind of a liberalization of these governments. And this, of course, is going to have to extend eventually into the federal level when the Constitution is created, as is evident in this handy-dandy chart. So notice before and after the war, who exactly was able to participate in government as a representative. Not everything the states did was a great idea. One of the problems is that there is a depression. The small farmers end up losing their land in times because they can't pay their debts. So the states feel terrible and they want to help the farmers out. So what do? They start printing a bunch of money and so that these farmers can pay back their debts. Well, the creditors aren't happy with that because it's taking away revenue from them, and it's also causing general inflation in the economy. We also see laws passed, such as the Force Acts, that are forcing debtors to have to accept this money, which is now worth less. And so that's a real problem. Nowhere was this problem more evident than in Massachusetts. As you remember, Daniel Shea led a rebellion against a courthouse because the court was about to take away the land of some farmers. And the real significance of the Shea's rebellion was that neither the states nor the federal government could actually stop this. They didn't have the power to stop this rebellion. And so it made all the colonies say, maybe we should rethink this organization because the federal government doesn't have control. Please proceed to part 2 of Philadelphia Freedom.